All right. Welcome, everyone. Hello. Hopefully, online can hear me. If you can hear me online, give us a thumbs up. Um, and that's hopefully. So, hi, everyone. Good afternoon. My name is Claire Whitley. I'm from the Student Learning Support Service here at Flinders. So, you'll probably see a little bit of us around the space as you go through your study. And particularly if you do reach out to us for any support or help, which I'll go through in a little while, then we will definitely, hopefully. But today I'm going to be talking specifically essential study skills for university. So this is going to give you a really broad overview of the sorts of skills that you can start to think about cultivating from the beginning of your study, and what that actually looks like in practice. How can you actually do that, and how can you do that effectively? But first, I just want to acknowledge that this lecture is taking place on Kaurna land. I want to pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging, and acknowledge that this land was never ceded. Um, Flinders operates on a number of traditional lands across the country. If you're on Teams and you'd like to send in your acknowledgement, if you're on a different part of country, you're very welcome to do that. So, as I said, today we're going to be covering this sort of big four skills. So thinking at university, reading at university, writing at university, and referencing skills. So as we go through this, I'm going to be giving you some sort of tips and tricks to kind of effectively uh, build on these skills. I'll also be pausing a lot for questions from both you in the room and online. So if you do have any questions, jot them down, and then, when I kind of call out, you're very welcome to ask them. You're also welcome to just pop your hand up as I'm talking through if you've got something that you really want to ask in the moment, and I'll pause and ask you what your question is. So yeah, very, very happy and very open to any questions that you might have. So thinking at university is sort of the first really big thing that I want to cover here. And critical thinking especially. So students, as I said, I'm in the SLSS, students often come to us with one big question that we hear a lot, right? And that is, why have I received a lower grade than I expected? I feel like I put in the work, I feel like I did the readings, I felt like I wrote really well. Why have I gotten this grade? And sometimes when that happens, we often investigate whether they have been explaining or reporting or describing rather than actually thinking. And this critical thinking is really, really important because in university, lecturers really want to know what you think about something and how you reason with that evidence that you've been given or that you've acquired throughout your research. So that is kind of the key to productive thinking at university, is this idea of critical thinking. So it's really at the heart of university study. And it can be really challenging because it requires us to kind of stay conscious of our thinking. And, while doing that, we need to be asking ourselves why we believe a particular thing and what has informed that belief and what are the limitations of that belief or that kind of angle that we have. So this helps you in everyday life as well as in your study. And it's a skill that you'll kind of continue to cultivate, not only in the university context, but in your everyday life. So you've probably heard a lot about critical thinking, particularly, as we get more into the era of information online and all that sort of stuff. There is this big emphasis on being able to evaluate what you are placed, what is placed in front of you critically. And this is also a really, really big factor at university. So a massive part of critical thinking in university is argumentation and arguing. So when we think about arguing in general, we might think of, arguing with family members, friends, all that sort of stuff, right? And that's certainly a type of arguing. But at university, in this kind of context, we are thinking about using arguments as a way to kind of hone and develop your critical thinking skills. So it's just another way that you can kind of practice and apply this idea of critical thinking. So constructing an academic argument kind of requires you to think about the pros and the cons and the strengths and the weaknesses of a particular idea or theory. And it involves critiquing ideas and kind of unpacking them. So do we agree or disagree with ideas? What are the weaknesses? And then when we've done that, we need to have evidence or kind of support to support our claims and our ideas around that. So when we think about an argument at university then, we are thinking of this little formula that I've got here. A claim plus some justification for that claim, and that justification is supported by evidence. So when we're thinking about a claim, we're thinking about, you know, a claim or a conclusion. So that's our kind of argument. What are we saying there? Then we think about the justification for that claim. So that's kind of our supporting premises, our reasoning. We can use logical connectives there to kind of make sure that those things are connected properly. And then we have evidence to support the premises that we see in our justification. So then, once we've got all of this, we have an example of an academic argument. We can start to see how that sort of takes shape. And you can kind of think about an academic argument in the context, what we always say is kind of in the context of a court case, right? So say, for example, you're a lawyer, you're in court, and you're arguing that your client is innocent. And you're saying, well, my client couldn't have done the crime because, and the justification would be that they were at a different place when the time occurred. So you've got the claim, my client is innocent, they didn't do the crime. Your justification is because I know that they were at a different place than when the crime occurred. Your evidence might be that you produce some security footage to kind of support this justification, because you can say, look, there is proof that my client is in this particular place, very far away from this crime, right? So you have just kind of made a claim, offered justification, and then supported that justification through evidence. So in a very similar way, we might assume that we're being asked, for example, to argue for or against free higher education for all, for example. I'm not sure if we don't have that yet. So we might start with the claim that free higher education encourages a more diverse student cohort. So that would be our claim. Then our justification will be that this is because free education allows populations that have traditionally been excluded from university wider access. And then to support this justification, we might find some data on the groups that are the highest represented in university communities, or we could refer to a study or an article on some of the reasons particular groups haven't been able to access university or things like that, right? So this is one way that critical thinking at university is a really important skill to have, and it's something that you'll continue to develop and apply in a lot of different ways. Because it means that we can kind of construct really strong academic arguments using our reasoning and our understanding of the facts, right? Do we have any questions online? No? Awesome. All right. Perfect. Any questions in the room so far? All good? Awesome. So this idea of critical thinking, a little bit more on this, it kind of involves your capacity to understand and evaluate and analyze the work of really important researchers. So this means, unfortunately, you often need to read a lot, right? There's a lot of reading that you'll probably have to do at university, whether those are books, whether they're chapters, whether they're journal articles, whether they're reports, data. You will have to read in some capacity. That's just kind of part of the journey. And you will not just have to understand what you read, but you'll need to be able to determine for yourself the kind of scholarly value of what you're reading and determine how much weight and importance you place on what you read. So you can take this evidence that you've gathered and analysis that you've done, and you can have the capacity to reason positively in an academic environment for yourself, whether that be, you know, in a tutorial or a presentation or a written work, whatever the case, you have this capacity to kind of reason positively and constructively in an academic environment. So that's kind of one of the things that critical thinking, when we're thinking about reading, gives you. So one element of reading in the kind of context of critical thinking is this idea of reading the work of others. So this involves kind of identifying and analysing arguments in other people's work. It involves evaluating the logic and the evidence that the author uses. So what kind of evidence are they putting forth to kind of support their arguments? Is this reliable? Is it relevant? Is it the best evidence that they can have? It involves assessing knowledge claims to see how strong or weak or convincing they are. And you can think about kind of when you're reading an opinion piece or a blog post to kind of see what the differences are here. So these are often, you know, these opinion pieces or blog posts often written really persuasively, right? So when you're sitting there reading it, whether it's, you know, if you're old school in a newspaper or otherwise online, maybe your favorite journalist or, you know, figure has a series of posts that they do, it might really kind of succeed in riling you up or persuading you to a specific standpoint. But often, particularly if it is sort of a blog post or something that isn't constructed with a lot of, I guess, quality control, there may not be a lot of evidence for those ideas. So thinking about what have they done to convince me of their argument? Is this convincing done in a way that is conducive to reliable evidence, facts, all those sorts of things? Or is it less solid? Is there a little bit of grey there? So critical thinking is essentially this ability to stop and question what we're reading. Is the author producing enough evidence to support what they're saying? Because ultimately, you need to figure out whether you're kind of convinced of their claims. And then the second side of critical thinking when we're thinking about reading is creating our own work. So then when we're thinking about creating our own work, we're thinking about things like making our own claims, presenting strong arguments. So these two things are really important, and you can kind of demonstrate your critical thinking in presenting these strong arguments by doing things like acknowledging debates. So, you know, bringing in some of the opposing arguments in this field. What are other people, what are detractors saying about this? And what's your kind of rebuttal to that? Why is your point just as strong, if not stronger, than those opposing viewpoints? And then through the reading you've done, being able to articulate, you know, the limitations of your own argument, right? And the ability to kind of contribute to the knowledge in a broad sense that's already out there on this particular topic. So these things will help you demonstrate that critical thinking. So as I said before, often students will come to us and say, why haven't I gotten this mark that I thought I would get? And if they are, you know, if you do find that you feel like you are describing or, you know, kind of explaining rather than actually analysing, you can think about doing these things. Acknowledge debates, acknowledge limitations, make sure that you're kind of contributing to this big discussion that's happening in an academic context here. And if you do want to learn more about critical thinking and kind of how it operates in a university context, we have a lot of resources. So the Student Learning Support Service has a flow page. It also has a Canvas page. We have a lot of guides online, so you can just type in SLSS Flinders study guides and a whole bunch of them will come up. And a lot of these are on things like critical thinking, how to write, how to, you know, read academically, all that sort of stuff. We also have lots of videos, things like that. So if you want to kind of get a better handle on this idea or any of the ideas that I talk about, or a lot of other ideas, we have a lot of resources that you can use kind of at your disposal. So any questions about critical thinking or about anything we've talked about so far, or anything online? Nothing online? All good so far in here? Perfect. All right. So reading at university. So we talked about thinking at university. Now we're talking about reading at university. This is, unfortunately for you all, an inescapable part of the university experience. You will have to read. And often we hear lots of these sorts of things. So, you know, students might come to us and say, you know, I enjoy reading, right? Or I'm trying to read for university, but I read slowly. So I might read one page, it might take me an hour to read one page. Or I like to read for pleasure, so I like to read on my own time. I like to read fiction or my favorite genre of book. But when I try and read for university, something doesn't click. Or I get to the end and I need to start again, right? So I haven't taken anything in, or I need to read everything 5 times. It's too dense. I don't understand it, or I get to the end of a sentence and I realize I haven't taken it in. So we get these things a lot, these problems, and they are very common problems. And, you know, they are things that you have to kind of keep on top of as you go through. And when we read for pleasure in our personal lives, we're kind of doing it often to escape or relax, or because it's interesting, right? So there is kind of a mood that we are inhabiting when we're reading for pleasure. And it's because of this, it's quite a passive process. It's something that you just kind of sit down and it happens to you and you're enjoying it, but there's not a lot of other stuff in your brain that's going on, right? When you're reading for study, it's a little bit different. And this is where we start to see these sorts of problems. And one way that we can kind of mitigate these problems is through this idea of active reading. So if you find that you have, you know, problems with being able to take in everything, active reading is a really good kind of process for you to think about. So that involves having essentially a purpose to your reading. So when you start to read, think about what you need to get out of this reading. What is it that I need to actually take from this reading in order for this to be a productive experience? So for example, you might be given some readings that are designed to be discussed in a tutorial situation, along with some discussion questions, for example. So if you get given things like discussion questions, use these in your reading. Let them guide what you're doing. If you have a few different readings for the week that you know that the tutorial is going to be focused on one particular topic, read with that in mind. So think about what you're actually doing this reading for. What is the aim of your reading? What do you actually need to get out of this process in order for you to have something to produce or to feel like you have used that reading time productively? And you can also think about what you already know. So think about what you already know in relation to your lecture content or other information, because this can also help you kind of fill in the dots. It can help you figure out what's important to read and what's not. And if you achieve any milestones in your reading, reward yourself, right? So if you read a chapter that you're really dreading, make sure you then kind of add a little bit of a reward so that your brain starts to associate that with something that is like a pleasurable outcome, right? So whether that's watching a movie or having a glass of wine or playing, you know, your favorite game, whatever that reward is, make sure that that's a part of your reading process so that there is kind of a light at the end of the tunnel, so to speak. And another way that we can kind of think about active reading is through the 5-point reading plan. So this is something that we often tell students to think about with their reading. And you're probably thinking, I don't want to have to do this for every single reading that I do, right? 5 points, that seems like a lot of work. However, the purpose of the 5-point reading plan is that you don't have to go through all 5 points every reading. And that's because by doing this, you can start to figure out if a reading is relevant or going to be productive or constructive for you to read. If it's not, you put it aside and you move on to the next one. If it is, this is going to help you make sure you stay on track and you're not spending too much time on it, because, you know, you might end up with a big stack of readings for a particular assessment, and you need to be able to figure out which ones are relevant, which ones you're going to read closely, which ones you can skim or scan, or which ones you can put aside for if and when you get some extra time, right? So we start with this first step, which is predict on the left here. So this is step number 1 of our 5-point reading plan. So using knowledge of things like the title, the abstract of the reading, all those sort of cursory pieces of information you can pick up, and remembering your purpose for your reading. So, you know, thinking about whether it's an assessment, whether it's a discussion, etc. Predict whether this book or reading is going to be relevant. So look at the title, look at the abstract, and make a prediction, a realistic prediction about whether or not this is going to be relevant to you. If you think, yep, this seems like it may be relevant, then you can move on to the skimming process. So this is where you skim through the reading for keywords, for whether you're seeing discussion or debate that you're kind of looking for in relation to your topic. You start to go a little bit deeper, but you're still kind of on that surface level, and you're looking for those kind of keywords or key terms or discussions or debates that you're aware of because you have been listening to lectures or through other information that you might have already gotten. Then, if you can find keywords that are relevant or debates that you think might be relevant, you move on to scanning. And then this is kind of where you, in the scanning process, you read the introduction and the conclusion. So just read those 2 things because they will often give you a really good indicator of what the bulk of the writing is actually saying in that whole entire thing. So if you can read the introduction and the conclusion, and it seems that they are introducing or summarizing points that are going to be relevant to you, then have a go at reading the subheadings of that piece of writing or the topic sentences, because again, those give you a really good indication of what is going to be talked about in each paragraph that they start. And so if those things seem really relevant, then you can move on to analysing. And this is where we kind of spend more time on it by analysing it closely. So if we've gotten through all of these stages and we're still thinking, yep, this seems relevant, then that's when we have to put the book down and kind of start to read it, or pick the book up, I should say, and start to read it really closely and start to analyse its ideas, its evidence, its arguments, all that sort of stuff. And then once or while we're doing that, you can start to note down those key ideas and why they're relevant. So think about, you know, is the ideas or the content in this piece of writing relevant for a particular question, for a particular assignment, for a particular part of an essay that you're writing, all those sorts of things. And this is really important because if you don't note down what you're reading, you won't remember what you've read, because remember that you're going to be reading a whole lot of stuff. So it's really important from the start to start noting down these things. It makes it a lot easier for you to organize your ideas and to put them all together logically. And it's also really important for referencing, which we'll talk about in a little while, because if you're able to note down things effectively and kind of well, with a lot of detail, then when you get to the referencing elements, you have all of that information there for you already. So other things to kind of think about if we're thinking about how you can utilize critical thinking in your reading. So you can think about questions or ask yourself questions like, what is the aim of the author? What message is the author trying to send? What issues or philosophies or ideas or theories have influenced the author? So can we actually see that they are utilizing other elements? And how are they utilizing those elements? What were the main arguments of the reading? Can we pick those out? That's really important. Were the arguments supported by evidence? Is the evidence that is supporting that reliable? So is it evidence that we think is reliable and reasonably objective? Were there any facts omitted? So have they kind of tried to strengthen their argument by just not mentioning some things that might complicate their argument? Did the author influence your opinion, and were you convinced by the arguments? So why or why not? And so that's where you can start to think about, is it just the language that they're using that's convincing me? Or is it the evidence that they're using for their justification that is helping to convince me here? You can think about what were the limitations of the study. So what do other researchers say? And how can you use the information from the text for your assignment? So once you've actually taken your notes and taken your ideas from this piece of writing, how can you actually apply those ideas in those notes? So that is essentially, I suppose, the reading element, or the most important pieces of reading knowledge you'll need for going through university in a really broad sense. Do we have any questions? All good? Any questions here? Perfect. All right. So we've done thinking, we've done reading. Now we're going to move into writing at university. So while thinking and reading are activities that you do kind of often individually, they're things that happen in your head. Writing is where we start to produce some output for our lecturers. So this is where you have a chance to actually start to apply the things that you're learning and thinking about. So academic writing can kind of allow you to demonstrate your critical thinking skills and your academic reading skills. And academic arguments are really key here. So a lot of the time, you will be presenting an academic argument in your written work, whether or not it looks like a typical essay argument structure, or whether it's a scientific report that you're doing, whether it's a case study where you have to argue that a particular outcome was met. A lot of the time, that's what you'll be producing, is some form of academic argument. And there are lots of different forms and genres of academic writing, as I say, but the process of tackling a written assignment remains reasonably consistent, even if you're writing things, you know, really broad things like essays or reports or literature reviews or proposals or case studies. All of these things you can kind of approach them in a similar way. And again, we have our handy arrow function, right? So in the writing process, we can kind of break it down into some steps, very similar to how we did with the 5-point reading plan. So we start with analysing, then we do some scoping and brainstorming, and that's where we look at the materials that we're going to use for the writing of it. Then we do some planning, we do some writing. So you can see that the actual act of writing is quite low down on the list. It's quite far down. But if you do all of these first elements, the writing aspect is actually kind of the easy part of this whole process. And then finally, we do editing and proofreading, which is something that students often forget about or feel that they don't have time to do, but it's a really, really important part of the process and can often be the difference between, you know, a grade. So that first step is analysing. So, you know, often when students get an essay question, you might only see the kind of broad parameters of the essay question and not identify the smaller, more specific things that the question is asking you to do. Okay, and this is really important because if you aren't able to look at those smaller, more specific things, you might end up with a really interesting essay, but it's not actually addressing the criteria or the instructions or what you have been asked to do. So this is a really important thing. So you need to make sure that you're responding to the direct task you have been set. And we do this by this idea of analysing and this practice of analysing. So analysing means breaking something down to its component parts to see how it works as a whole. And yeah, we can do this by kind of analysing our task. So if we would think about this in the context of a real essay question that you might get, you can think about it by first looking at the content words. So these content words are, they kind of relate to the topic, and these are the main discussion points of your assignment. So if our question or our task was that higher education should be free for all in Australia, and then we want to discuss that, our content words here would be higher education, and free. So those are our sort of main ideas of our essay. Those are our kind of big topics that we're thinking about in this essay. Then we can look at the limiting words. So these are words that make the scope more specific. They narrow the scope, they make the parameters more specific, because otherwise we're going to be looking at something that's really, really massive and we don't have room for in our essay. So in this particular question, the limiting word would be Australia. So higher education should be free for all in Australia, discussed. So we're not talking about the US, we're not talking about other countries or other areas, we're talking specifically about the Australian context. And then finally, we have instructional words. So these tell us how to do the assignment. So these can be words, for example, like discuss, other words like analyze or explore or summarize. And all of these different words that we might have here, discuss, analyze, explore, summarize, these may seem quite similar on the surface, but they often have really distinct meanings. So for example, when we're thinking about the idea of discussing or discuss, we are looking at something from more than one angle or perspective. So what does that idea of discussing actually mean? And how can we demonstrate that we are doing that in this essay? So that's how you might begin to break down an essay question or an essay task. Then once you've done that, so you've done your analysing, you can move down to the scoping and brainstorming section of your writing journey. So this is essentially the research process. This is where we start the research process. And it's where we're going to find some evidence to support our writing. And you can kind of use the broad to medium to complex approach to kind of achieve this. So you can start by looking at really general scoping searches. So this means using things like Google is okay to start with right at the beginning because it can give you a really broad knowledge. You might not use that in your reference list. It might not be something that you actually use for evidence, but it can help you get a sense of the idea. It can help you get a sense of particular important theorists, particular phrases that are really useful for you. All those sorts of things can be really useful in that kind of general scoping search at the beginning. And then once we've done that, we can look at the resources or the readings that you have been given by your lecturer or your topic coordinators. So the reading list is going to give you quite precise papers or materials of better quality than Google. So you can start with Google, then have a look at these. But the problem here, you can probably guess, is that everyone has access to these readings, right? So what differentiates your research process from everyone else in your class? So you need to kind of find more than those readings to ensure that you're looking at things with the appropriate amount of detail, that you are actually researching yourself. And if you're unsure, you can always kind of have a chat to your tutor about how you can find more information, because they can often tell you really good databases or kind of research areas for your discipline. So that can be really useful. And then that way you can kind of get to the more complex stage of actually going into a particular database and starting to research yourself. So once we've done the scoping and brainstorming, we can then move on to planning. So planning is the most important part of the process. This is where the real kind of work is going to happen. So it's the one that you're going to therefore spend the most time on. And a good planning stage focuses your research and your reading, and it also focuses your writing. So it makes sure that you don't deviate from the topics or from the rubrics that you've been given. And there are lots of different ways of planning. So things like mind maps or linear planning or bullet points. So whatever kind of works best for you and for the way you think and the way you operate. But think about the structure of your piece of writing generally. So which idea is going to go into which paragraph? So generally we will say each paragraph should have only one big idea, right? And in that paragraph, you're going to expand on that big idea. You're going to offer evidence. you're going to offer some contextualization, but each paragraph should have one big idea generally. And generally, the introduction and the conclusion will be about 10% of your word count, right? So plan around these words. So think about if you have, X amount of words left, you can do X amount of paragraphs. So for example, if I have a 1,000-word essay, I know my introduction and my conclusion are going to each be about 100 words. Then I know that I've got about 800 words to play with in terms of the main body paragraphs. So then I might think about, for example, about 250 words per main body paragraph. And that gives me a little bit of leeway. And you can also use this planning to kind of introduce references that you've found. So you can put in a reference into a particular paragraph, an essay plan, so you can see how you will integrate that evidence. So that's where you can start to bring in some of those notes and some of those references that you've taken. And then writing, if you've done all of these elements, becomes the easy part. So if you've planned really well, this will become the easy part of your writing because you are essentially just filling in some of the blanks, some of the gaps. And you want to make sure that some tips for writing specific, you want to make sure that you're using formal but simple language. So your goal is to be understood. So it doesn't mean that it needs to be really complex. And when we think about formal language, we're thinking about writing that is addressed and kind of tailored to our audience, which are probably going to be lecturers and tutors. So it doesn't need to be complex. They want to read something that they can understand easily. Remember, they could be marking 50 or 60 or 70 of these pieces of work, right? They don't want to have to kind of play around with the language. Let the material be complex. Let your ideas be complex. The writing doesn't have to be complex, right? So that's something that is really, really important to carry through as you study. But you can use your language to demonstrate your logic and your arguments. So you might use discourse markers. So these are words like however or therefore or as a result. So these kind of show you how ideas are connected to each other. We might use reporting verbs. So these are words that introduce or report on research. So for example, Smith claims or Mulvey establishes or Jones argues, things like that. And then we also want to take note here of the referencing style that we're being asked to use when we're thinking about reporting verbs. So, because this is going to change the language a little bit. So for example, APA generally prefers you to use past tense for reporting verbs. So it would be Smith claimed or Mulvey established, but another referencing style might prefer present tense. So it's just about being aware of those little nuances. And then because we always get this question about using I, a general, I suppose, rule is that for reflective writing or, writing that perhaps is a little bit more creative, the use of I can be okay, but generally we say to try and steer clear of using I in your academic writing, just because most of the time it's not appropriate and it doesn't kind of formally count as formal language, right? And then once you've done this writing, you can move on to the editing and proofreading. So there is a difference between editing and proofreading. And so it means that the editing is kind of at the macro level. So it's at the big overarching level. So here you're looking at content and you're looking at content in terms of accuracy and clarity. So is it accurate? Is it clear? Can we understand it? And then proofreading is the micro level. So the kind of smaller, more nuanced, more detailed elements. So here we're looking at the mechanics of your language. So, spelling, grammar, making sure all of that is kind of correct and appropriate. So a lot of students will often, as I say, lose marks for not editing or proofreading, and it can be the difference between a higher grade and a lower grade. So it's really, really important to make sure that you make time for that. And I'll give you some other kind of I suppose, strategies for how you might make use of some of our services in making sure that your grammar and all those sorts of things are looking okay. So, any questions? All good online? Perfect. All right. And then finally, we have referencing. So referencing is our kind of, I guess, last really key skill. And it's really, really important because integrity, and therefore academic integrity, is really important to the university. And integrity is actually one of Flinders University's 4 core values. So academic integrity has to do with the principles of honesty and respect and trust and fairness. And it shows that you know how to do your work in the right way. So a part of academic integrity is referencing. And so we can think about why we reference. We reference to acknowledge the work of others. We reference to enable someone to access the same resources. So often if a lecturer is reading an essay and they find a claim that you're making really interesting, or they're not sure, that they've heard it before, they will go to your reference list and see where you've gotten that information and go and read it themselves, right? So it's really important that the referencing that you're using is appropriate and correct so that they're able to do that. It also shows that you have conducted thorough and balanced research. So it's your opportunity to kind of show that you are doing this research, you're doing this work, you've spent the time putting in this effort. So this is your chance to kind of show that off. And then also we reference finally to meet the requirements of academic integrity. So again, being transparent, being open, being honest about where we're getting our ideas and our resources from. This is a really, really vital part of academic integrity. So then we can think about when we reference. So, we know why we reference, but when do we actually have to put in an in-text citation or include a reference in our reference list? And this is essentially any time that you are using an idea which is not originally your own. So many students can kind of misunderstand, and they sort of believe that you only need to reference when you have the exact words from the original source. So they reference the words, but what you are really referencing is the idea. So anytime you use an idea that has been informed or taken from another piece of writing, you must reference that piece of writing. And of course, while you do need to, reference the idea, if you are taking writing directly from a source, you also need to reference that. So it's essentially about any time you take anything from a source, you need to be able to reference it accurately and appropriately. And this includes paraphrasing and summarising as well as that quoting. So yeah, we reference ideas. And at Flinders, there are lots of different referencing styles that are common and that you may be asked to use. So your topic coordinator will generally let you know what referencing style you need to use for your topic, but it will vary. So you might be doing 1 degree, but all of your topics may use a different referencing style. So it's really important to keep track of what you need to use for each one. The most common one at university or at Flinders is APA 7. That's what we see the most of. But depending on your discipline, this will change. And some topic coordinators say, I don't mind which one you use as long as you're consistent and as long as you're using it correctly. So you will be told that. And if you're not told, you can always ask what referencing style you're expected to use. And once you've done this, you can find a study guide that gives you information about how to use that referencing style. So we have, the SLSS have a whole heap of study guides for the most common styles at Flinders. So for example, here we've got the APA 7th edition, and we've also got the Harvard referencing edition. So you can find all of the different resources at that link there. But again, if you just type in Flinders SLSS study guides, the list of those will come up. And towards the end of these guides, you will actually be given a whole bunch of examples and templates for different types of resources and how to reference them. So I highly recommend, and I still do this, if you have an assessment, just get one of these guides. You can also come into the Learning Lounge. We've got hard copies of them. and have them in front of you as you are reading and writing and as you're doing your referencing, because it's a lot easier than having to go back and forth and make sure that everything's kind of correct after the fact.
I have a question online.
Yeah, question online.
So I'll just use this just so everyone can hear.
So just a question online. A student is asking, is there any format to write the assignment in? So for example, do you need a cover page?
That's a really good question. So generally, Flinders doesn't have specific requirements for things like cover pages, fonts, all that sort of stuff. If there are requirements, that will be on a topic level. So your topic coordinator will tell you, I would like you to write in size 12 font, and I would like you to include this cover letter, and they'll supply that to you. But in terms of a kind of universal university style, we don't have anything specifically. I think generally just making sure that it's formal, that it's easy to read, it's a regular kind of appropriate font, so not crazy kind of wingdings or anything like that, is kind of generally the appropriate way to go. Any other questions so far? Perfect. All right. And just as an aside, we also have access at Flinders to EndNote, which is a referencing software. So if you do know how to reference, again, this doesn't do your referencing for you necessarily. I mean, it can put it together, but it's really important that you know how to reference, because then you can identify whether it's done it correctly or not. But particularly if you're doing things like, really big essays, or, generally it's something that's used mainly by postgraduate students. So if you're doing a master's thesis or a PhD thesis, EndNote is a place where you can put all of your references and all of your citations, and it keeps it all there very neatly. So again, not particularly necessary if you're an undergraduate, or if you're not doing a lot of writing in that kind of traditional sense, but it's something to be aware of, that we have access to that as an institution, and you can install it and get it for free and get support for it, and kind of learn how to use it as a Flinders student. So other kind of quick skills to think about. We often get this question, do I need maths? So maths is something that, sometimes you will need it in kind of unexpected topics that you may not necessarily be aware that you need it. So for example, for nursing, you need to do drug calculations, psychology, you need to do statistics. If you're doing education, you need maths to pass your land type. So there are times where you may need maths, even though you might not be expecting to need maths. But if you do, don't panic. We also have a whole bunch of resources on maths and maths kind of areas and applications of maths. So I've got one here on drug calculations, but we've got a whole bunch of them. So again, if you type in Flinders SLSS study guides online, they will all come up. They're also on our Flow and Canvas pages. So hopefully you're able to get access to them. And lastly, or I guess one of the last things that I just want to indicate is that there is a lot of support at Flinders, and we take care, I guess, of the study support more specifically. So anything to do with academic study skills, time management, being able to organise yourself around your study, we can help with. So my tips are to follow your study guides, and again, you can find them there. See the Student Learning Support Service Flow or Canvas sites. So again, those have all of our resources there. You can also visit us in person. So we have a drop-in service called the Learning Lounge. It's on level 2 of the Central Library. So essentially right across from here and upper level. And we have learning advisors, dedicated learning advisors that are present in the Commons, which is just an open area of the library as you go up the stairs, Monday to Friday, 11 to 2:30. So they're there in the breaks, and they're there every weekday apart from public holidays. And you don't have to book an appointment, you can just come in and sit down in that study space. They can help you with things like, referencing or structuring your essay, or, any kind of academic writing, time management, study skills, referencing skills, anything that we've covered today. They can't proofread your assessment for you, so they can't actually sit down and read your whole essay. But if there's a paragraph that you're not sure about, you want to improve, they might be able to look over that and give you some pointers for how you might improve that particular paragraph. But they are really, really useful. And this is just a kind of, I suppose, overview of all of our different services. So we have the Learning Lounge, as I talked about. We have Studiosity. So if you can't get into campus, but you still would like some help from an advisor, or you have a draft of an essay that you want some feedback on, you can submit it to Studiosity, or you can chat live with a learning advisor 24/7, and they will give you some feedback or give you some help on, you know, any kind of assessment question or writing that you might have. So there is a limit for how much you can, you know, kind of how much work you can put through to Studiosity. So it's 10 interactions per calendar year. Per calendar half year. And the maximum words you can put in one go is just been updated to 8,000. Yeah. So you're able to put in essentially a full essay into Studiosity, and they can give you feedback on things like grammar, language, style, referencing, all of that sort of stuff. So they're really, really useful. And as a Flinders student, you have access to that service. So make use of that service. We also have the English for Academic Purposes program. So if you are finding it all a little bit overwhelming, you know, particularly around academic writing, academic style, all that sort of stuff, we have a series of workshops that I'll show you in a moment that can kind of help you. And they are for, again, any Flinders student. So you don't have to be, you know, in a specific degree to attend these. You just need to be a Flinders student. And then we also have the Learning Toolkit, which is on the Flow and Canvas sites of our SLSS pages. And they essentially house all of our resources, all of our tips and tricks, all of our support lives in the Learning Toolkit there. And again, as I said, we've got our English for Academic Purposes workshops. So you can see we've got a lot of different ones that we cover. So we start with academic writing, kind of the basics of it. Then we go to writing clearly and concisely. We have a special workshop on paraphrasing and quoting. We do writing effectively, reading effectively. Then we go into writing for the sciences. So this is any kind of science, whether it's, you know, biology or earth sciences, but also physical sciences, health sciences. They talk a little bit about that. Understanding academic readings, and then finally finishing off with editing and proofreading. So these are in person and online. You do need to register, but it doesn't kind of cost anything, and it's just so you can get that reminder in your calendar. So please feel free to come along to any of those. And again, just a bit more information about Studiosity, and I just want to give a special shout out to Studiosity's assignment calculator, which is very, very useful. You can put in when your assignment is due, what it's called, and it will kind of give you a little bit of a breakdown of the timeline that you should have in approaching this assessment. So I find that that's really, really useful if you're feeling a bit overwhelmed and you want to plan everything out beforehand, which I highly recommend you do. This can be really useful. So that is pretty much it for me. Do we have any questions either in person or online before we wrap up? We've got someone online. Yeah, do we want to start with online?
So one of the students is asking, do we use Firefox or Google Chrome for our assignments, classes, online classes, etc.?
Oh, that's a good question. So generally there isn't kind of any specific browser that you need to use. However, if any of your classes are on Collaborate, Collaborate sometimes works best or sometimes only on Google Chrome, which is just kind of a weird little quirk. But in terms of, you know, going on to Flow, submitting assessments, all that sort of stuff, it doesn't really matter what browser you use. Whichever one you find works best for you is fine.
Just on that, because we've been talking about Flow and Canvas, and I've just made an assumption that everyone knows what that is. So they're our online learning management systems, so where all your materials will be. The university's in a transition year, so you may already know this, but in a transition year, going from our old system, which is Flow, to a new system, which is Canvas. So Flow's on a program called Moodle. So you may hear that term, but usually we call it Flow. And then we're transitioning to Canvas. So if most new students will probably just be on Canvas, but you may also have some topics in Flow, which just means that there'll be 2 different systems that you're using, learning management systems. So what Claire's saying is with Flow, which is the old system, you would sometimes the classes will be through Collaborate. So any of your sort of online
Yes.
tutorials, etc., will be in Collaborate, which is the system. In Canvas, I believe they're all on Teams.
Yes, I think.
Yep. Microsoft Teams. So if anyone wants any more information about that, there is in the library, which we just mentioned before, there's a help desk, a Canvas help desk. So you'll be able to see it. There's like panda toys and stuff like that. That's their mascot. So you can go find out more about that. But yeah, you should know which systems you're using. You should be advised of that by your teaching staff.
Awesome. Thanks, Mel. Yeah, didn't offer an explanation at the beginning, so thanks for that. Any it is, yeah. Any questions in the room? Yeah.
So when citing resources, do we use APA style format?
Yes, so the question was, when citing resources, do we use the APA format? So it will essentially depend on the topic that you're doing. So the topic coordinator will let you know what format you need to use, and that format might change depending on the topic that you're doing. So you might have 4 topics that you're doing. Topic 1 and 2 want you to use APA 7. Topic 3 and 4 want you to use Harvard, for example. So it will just depend on what your topic coordinator, which style they want you to use. Yeah, so it'll be very different depending on what you're studying. Any other questions? Yeah.
So I've got Okta Mobile downloaded, just it's got a lot of information there. Is there any other apps, like Canvas have an app, is there any other apps that you recommend to download just to make it start to?
That's a really good question. So the question for online people was, are there any apps apart from Okta that we'd recommend having to kind of get yourself organised for uni? I think that Canvas does have an app. I'm not 100% sure, but I think Okta is the main one. That houses essentially everything that you will need in terms of your study experience going through. And even if it doesn't, the good thing about Okta is what you can do is create your own little sections on Okta. So if there's a site that you go to a lot, so for example, there is a system that wasn't originally linked to Okta when it first came in for me when I was a PhD student. So what I did was I created a little section in Okta that essentially housed that system. And that's something that you can do through the kind of Okta homepage. I think there's a little section where you can add things. So short answer is Okta is kind of the one-stop shop. So hopefully you won't need too many other apps that I can think of.
The only other might not be relevant.
Online, depending where they are, but the only other one that I think people use is Lost on Campus.
Yes.
So you can download that app. It's like a little orange. I think that one has a panda on it too.
I think it
Does it? Yeah. Just coincidentally, but yeah. So I get lost on this campus a fair bit, or used to, especially when I first started here. So that one can be quite helpful to find where rooms and everything are. Yep.
Yeah, that's a really good idea. Is Lost on Campus. Yeah. Yes. Back. Oh, Lost on Campus doesn't work on Android phones. Oh, well, there you go.
Good luck, Andrew.
Yeah.
With that, it also is really bad on data. Like sometimes if you're using your own personal data, it won't load or it won't work.
Okay.
So use the Wi-Fi on this kit. Otherwise it will not work.
Okay. All right. Well, that's good. Yeah.
So for those online, if you are coming on campus at some point, we've just been advised that the Lost on Campus app doesn't work for Android phones. So it's unfortunate. It's actually not an app that is run by Flinders. It's run by external people. But, we just know that a lot of people find it useful. And the other tip was to log into the Eduroam, which is university's Wi-Fi when you're here because it actually can really drain your data. So yeah, I'd recommend that's probably another good point. When you're here, you may as well just log into Eduroam anyway because it's free Wi-Fi.
And it's pretty good. It's, yeah, reasonably fast. Any other last questions? All good, awesome. All right, yes, well, we are here in the Learning Lounge. Whenever you do have any study skills questions, please feel free to come and ask us. We're always here. That's what we're here for. And I hope you have a great rest of the day and a great rest of O Week, and you get lots of free food and all that sort of stuff. And I hope to see you all around campus in the next semester. Thanks, everyone.